thumbs up when we're good. We're good. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's panel, listening to The Cry of the Earth, Union's Response to Climate Emergency. My name is Ryan Felder, a third-year Master's of Divinity student from Philadelphia, Mississippi, and I'll be co-facilitating tonight with my peer and classmate, Jennifer Helmsicki, a first-year Master's of Divinity student from New Jersey. First of all, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few logistics. So Jennifer and I will be asking our panelists questions for about an hour, and at around 7:30 p.m., we'll open up the discussion for questions from our audience and our community assembly participants. And secondly, I'd like to thank everyone who has made this whole process possible, which include our experts with us here tonight, the Center for Earth Ethics, Green Faith, the Climate Mobilization, our Eco-Justice Caucus volunteers who've been working really hard on this for almost 2 years, and of course, Union Theological Seminary. And in particular, Vice President Fred Davey and Dean Pamela Cooper-White, who have been a part of this conversation since it started in the now infamous Plant Chapel in the fall of 2019. So thank you, everyone, and let's go ahead and give ourselves like an applause for keeping it up this far. And this evening, we're going to be talking about Union's response to the climate crisis. This panel of experts is a part of our community assembly process for drafting what we're calling a Community Mobilization Action Plan. And we'll refer to that as like CMAP sometimes throughout tonight. And basically, after a year of mobilizing and organizing by students in the Eco-Justice Caucus, Union's Board of Trustees voted to declare a climate emergency. We did so acknowledging that this crisis is not in any way a new thing. It would be irresponsible and inaccurate to say that the climate crisis began with the 2018 IPCC report stating that we had less than, well, 12 years at the time, but 10 years to mobilize and transform our society to avoid a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures. No, this crisis is long and has roots deep in the history of the land Union Theological Seminary now occupies. A land inhabited and cared for by Lenape peoples for generations before their land was stolen by European colonizers and they were displaced through violence. It was on this land and others in what would become the United States that the slave trade took hold in the soil through extractive colonial economies, extractive both on human bodies of enslaved Black workers and the earth itself, and that this fed the Industrial Revolution with raw materials. The Anthropocene, our current geological epoch in which human activity has an outsized impact on the history of the natural world, is inseparable from this history of domination. And perhaps it's better to not even call it the Anthropocene. Perhaps it's better to categorize it as the Eurocene or the plantation scene or the capitalist scene to talk about the type of humans that cause this and the type of human activity that's responsible. We should always recall and remember that the crises we now face have been faced and are currently faced disproportionately by millions of oppressed, primarily and overwhelmingly Black and brown peoples. This history and enduring cruel legacy is foundational to the intersection of crises we now experience. I speak primarily to a seminary community interrupted and scattered by a global pandemic and reeling from a racist hate crime committed at our own New York campus last week. So when we say emergency, we mean to listen to the cry of the earth and her people experiencing various forms of oppression and ecological devastation. We know that this crisis is not new, but perhaps it's not yet too late to engage in a just transition, to abolish systems that kill human beings and our ecosystems, to replace those systems with regenerative communities and institutions of care, and to mobilize and make the necessary transformations for a more ecologically resilient and just present and future. So, in response to Union's declaration of climate emergency, a community assembly of about 19 participants, students and faculty and alums, have been engaged in drafting what we're calling a Community Mobilization Action Plan. For the last 2 weeks, we've been meeting asynchronously to draft together a 10-year Community Mobilization Action Plan for Union Theological Seminary. Tomorrow, we'll be finalizing that document. Tonight, we're having a conversation with some experts we've been consulting with throughout and in the beginning of this process that'll better help us inform our decisions that we'll make tomorrow and to inform our greater community what we've been up to. So with that, I'll have Jennifer get us started by introducing our panelists and beginning the questions.
Thank you, Ryan. So I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed panelists. I'll begin with Corinna Gore, who is the founder and director of the Center for Earth Ethics here at Union. The center bridges the worlds of religion, academia, policy, and culture to discern and pursue the changes that are necessary to stop ecological destruction and create a society that values the long-term health of the whole. She is also an ex officio member of the faculty of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. The Reverend Abby Mohop is Green Faith's Director of Education and Training. Abby previously coordinated Green Faith and Drew Theological School's Green Seminary Initiative, and she coordinates Green Faith's relationships with seminaries across the US, as well as the Green Faith Fellowship. She holds Masters of Divinity and Masters of Theology degrees from McCormick Theological Seminary, is the PhD candidate at Drew Theological School, and is ordained in the Presbyterian Church. The Reverend Dr. Pamela Cooper White is Dean and Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Christiane Brooks Johnson Professor of Psychology and Religion here at Union. She has long been an advocate for climate justice, especially as climate change disproportionately impacts women and communities of color. She was an original faculty signer for Columbia Theological Seminary in Atlanta onto the Green Seminary Initiative. She presented to Union's Center for Earth Ethics on the topic of psychological causes of climate change denial, and she participated with faculty and students in the October 2019 climate strike and march in New York City. Reverend Darrell Rich is a pastor, teacher, public speaker, and community builder. He holds a Bachelor of Environmental Design and Architecture, a Master's of Infrastructure Planning, and Master of Divinity degrees. He is currently completing a PhD in Community Development. He is a member of the American Academy of Religion, the Association for the Sociology of Religion, and a Senior Fellow of the Environmental Leadership Program. He is also a United States Green Building Council Scholar and was recently awarded the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Social Justice Award from Drew University. Owl, Stephen Dennison Smith, received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of California at Santa Cruz and his Doctorate of Jurisprudence from UC Berkeley. Mr. Smith is a member of several bar associations, including the United States Supreme Court of Bar of Attorneys. He's assisted Indigenous Navajo, Tohono O'odham, Guyanese villagers, and the Ramapo with major environmental issues in national courts, as well as before Congress and the United Nations. Jeff Brown directs government relations activities for the Pew Charitable Trust domestic environmental campaigns, which have ranged from preserving our nation's public lands to promoting clean energy policies and improving the ability of communities to cope with flooding and he has also been involved with many of Pew's oceans and international campaigns. Previously, he was the legislative director for the National Environmental Trust and spent 10 years working in the US Senate on a range of environmental, energy, and economic development issues. He holds a master's degree in resource policy and behavior from the University of Michigan and a bachelor's in American Studies from Yale University. And finally, Petra Toombs is the executive director of the Ramapo Lenape Community Center in Mahwah, New Jersey, operated by the Ramapo Mountain Indians. She's in preliminary fellowship with the Unitarian Universalist Association and will be ordained in May. Congratulations in advance. Petra has been an advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations, a graduate from Union with a Master's of Divinity, having majored in church history. Her focus is largely addressing the doctrine of discovery as it has fostered racism and extreme marginalization for Indigenous communities globally. So thank you all again for being with us here tonight. Thank you for your valuable counsel and input so far. And let's get started with our conversation for this evening. So to open up our conversation, I think it's important for us to understand the context and the severity of the climate crisis and sort of thinking around the intersections of ecological, social, and theological crises. So for our first question, we'll take up a good amount of time, about 30 minutes for everyone to answer. I'll keep an eye on the time. But perhaps starting with Karena, I would ask, how do you understand the climate crisis? Or in keeping with our title tonight, how do you hear the cry of the earth?
Unmute. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer. I want to first acknowledge the Eco-Justice Caucus at Union. You seminarians have really taken leadership in providing this space and building this platform. And I'm just really grateful for that work and to be connected to everybody here in this ongoing conversation. So there are a few ways to look at the climate crisis. I'll start by saying that there are two megatrends that have been worsened since the Industrial Revolution that are really about the relationship of all of humanity to the earth. Now, of course, we need to then break down all of humanity in terms of power, and that's a very important part of this. But the two megatrends are pollution and depletion. So depletion in the sense of the stripping of the carbon sinks, deforestation, the stripping of soils and wetlands and so on. And then the pollution is, of course, largely driven by the extracting of fossil fuels from inside the earth and burning it. And so, as we know, this is producing greenhouse gases that are trapped in the thin shell of the atmosphere that we see as the sky, but has a limit. And we've already begun to see the impacts from the stronger storms, the droughts, the wildfires, the floods, and that can certainly be interpreted as the voice of the earth. And so I think that it's important to keep in mind those two megatrends. But of course, there are also ways to look at it that involve root causes. Why are those two megatrends happening? And I would say that there are two things I would lift up. One is the illusion of separation between humanity and the rest of nature, the illusion that we're separate and superior. And this most certainly has involved the distortion of a theological teaching. And specifically, I would lift up the book of Genesis, the idea of dominion and imago Dei, human beings being in the image of God, that because of the way in which history unfolded, there was this marriage between Christianity and colonization, and the distortion of that scripture was really amplified. And so the culture that we now live in the United States has an outsized influence on the world because of the historical moment after the two world wars, when America was ascendant, and there were many good things about the United States, but this There are also, as we are really, really examining now and reckoning with, some blind spots and some flaws. And so I would say the root cause of the illusion of separation, and then also in a related way, the economic development paradigm or model that really has prioritized short-term monetary gain. And no matter the depletion or pollution or inequality of that short-term monetary gain. And so, so looking at those root causes is very important. Obviously, in terms of the first one, both of them, white supremacy has played a big role. I know that we're all cognizant of that, and the deep work that needs to be done. Anti-racist works, and in particular, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous violence and discrimination is very much tied to this. So I don't want to take too long, but I really appreciate that question, and I believe that we have very important work to do at Union that we can contribute to this, and I'm just delighted to be with my fellow panelists and hear what they have to say.
Wonderful, thank you. Reverend Rich, I'm curious to hear, with your focus on environmental justice and community development, especially as it concerns the role of the church in communities, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what the climate crisis means for you and for your work.
Well, let me also say thank you for inviting me into this most important conversation, I believe. Corinna, I think you really just set the stage. You framed the conversation historically. And so without kind of redressing much of what you've already said, I think I want to lift up two things. I want to focus in on the historical realities of dehumanization. I want to focus in a little bit on what it means that the forced migration of a people from their homeland to the Americas, and then also the forced migration of Native Americans from their space, their place. So there's some other kind of historicity that I'd like to drill down into, because what it also means is that within that dehumanization, we have said that certain bodies are expendable as opposed to other bodies. And so this is in part in line with my theological pastoral work, which really anchors in an incarnational presence. It really anchors in an embodied theology. And so what does it mean that certain bodies, particularly the bodies of Black and brown folk, have been deemed expendable? And Corinna, again, just to underscore, I think you did an excellent job of framing this, because as we talk about the cry of the earth, we also are talking about all of the systems within the earth. So we're talking about religious institutions which have supported this dehumanization. We're talking about academic institutions. We're talking about medical practices and science, so forth and so on. All of the institutions which have supported the denigration of human bodies. The next thing I want to lift up, though, is has more to do with the biblical text. As you said, my scholarship is steeped in the sociology of religion. My prior work is in community development, architecture, and urban planning. But there is this one scripture when I think about the question, what does the cry of the earth sound like? This scripture out of Romans chapter 8 comes to mind, where the writer simply says something to the extent of, the whole earth groans. It groans as if having birth pangs. And so that image comes to mind when I think of the cry of the earth. When I think of our current climate crisis, I think of the travail of a woman in labor, that is how intense this moment is. It is almost as if there is a systematic undoing of created order. And so this a cataclysmic future seems to be inevitable, with the melting of ice caps and rising sea levels, erosion. Without digging too deep here, or or being humdrum, but it is a serious matter. It is a serious matter. And so when I think of the cry of the earth, when I think of the ways in which I enter into this story, I enter into it from the perspective of an African-American male. I enter into it having professional experience in development. And for me, I'm thinking of the ways in which what we build matters, how it impacts the earth. It matters. There's an inextricable connection there. And so I want to lift that up as well. We can't have this conversation about climate crisis without talking about urbanization. And I'm sure that's something we'll get into a little bit later. But I think to the cry of the earth, it is a cry from all systems as to how white supremacy, how injustice, how colonialization have actually penetrated and caused us to believe that we can dominate. We can do what we want with what God has lent to us. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Owl, I see that you've raised your hand, so I'm not, feel free to respond to Reverend Rich, and feel free to, offer your own response to the prompt at this time.
Well, just I apologize. I just got out of a Earth Day march here in Montclair, and it was good to see a lot of young people in the march as well. It was organized by Extinction Rebellion, I think the Green Party, and some other people. And I'm here in the Universal Unitarian Church. They were graceful enough to offer me the space for this Zoom call. So I just wanted to thank them for that. And I just wanted to follow up. I mean, I heard the last question and then the signal got a little bit funky, but cry of the earth, what Reverend Darrell Rich was talking about as well. I can just say from my own experience, I remember being out in the Southwest with one of the grandmothers, Danae, Navajo in their language. And she's the one that really kind of in a very real tangible sense introduced me to the concept of the earth as a living being. And they were being relocated for a coal mine. She was in a meeting with the Hopi tribal chairman, and she brought me into the meeting. She started talking about the coal being the liver of the earth. And I thought it was just an interesting metaphor. But then when I read up more did research on coal or carbon, the chemical structure of coal is carbon. And carbon does have certain unique filtering properties. And when you have water that's triple carbon filtered, that's why they're using it, because of that structure. So the knowledge that they had was, I think Dr. James Lovelock in the modern era is the best exponent of this in a scientific sense. But I know that these grandmothers, many of whom didn't speak English at all, and the Dene people, they weren't waiting for the latest journal article from Dr. Lovelock. This is something that came from their culture. So, I mean, the earth, hearing the cry of the earth, that's like hearing the cry of another person, because the earth is a living being. And a lot of the coal, other minerals in the earth have a certain function, and that I think that we're just really beginning to understand in our modern industrial world that many indigenous people have always understood. So that's all I just wanted to say on that topic. But thank you for your patience.
Thank you. I'm not sure if we still have Petra. Hello. But I would love to pass it to you, given all of your work with our Indigenous communities as well, to hear about your perspective on the climate crisis, or what the cry of the earth sounds like to you.
Well, I wanted to thank you for having me, and also to just thank all of those who have spoken before me. Certainly Karena started off with talking about many of these issues that she and I have discussed regarding the domination of what's happening here. What is it that we are really living with? And earth in and of itself, the cry of the earth is, I can't breathe. The cry of the earth is exactly what Black and brown people have been saying, I can't breathe, because we are a part of the earth. The earth is one with us. We are from her. She has birthed us from her womb. And it's such a mind shift for us to understand that, because in Western society, we are a separate category. We are supposed to be stewards of and caretakers of, but really we are in this society dominators of. And we miss understanding being immersed into earth, being a relative of earth, recognizing that we are two-legged. We are related to the four-legged. We are related to the plant people. We are related to those who crawl and those who swim. We are related to the energies of rock. We are related to the energies of water. We are water. And if we don't connect with that, that is why we lose our minds. We have been burning down the house and we are paying the price. You know, all of this understanding has come about recognizing the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of Christian discovery, you know, the right to discover some place, even though there are human beings who have been there for hundreds and thousands of years. That mindset tells us we have the right to discover and take over, to remove those said peoples and do what we will with their land. And that's what the society has been doing. We have been doing it for over 500 years, and we are paying the price. I always think of that origin tale, because if we don't remember what that is, or we don't link to that, that is why we are continuing to repeat our bad behaviors. We repeat the same patterns. And how can we go forward? We need to change our mindset. We need to shift. I feel a sense of hope this week, only in that a crack in that domination code seemed to happen with the verdict that came out this week. We must always think of what happens to people happens to the earth. What happens to the earth happens to all of us. And with that crack in white supremacy that is designed to protect only certain members of the population, certainly not all, there is the possibility of hope that we can change our mindset in order to be fair and just to each person and to the earth herself, that we will respect. And hopefully that's what can come from this. We always have to continue to push. And I'm so grateful for this Climate Emergency Assembly, because this is this community's opportunity to come together and do that critical thinking and talking and discussing, so that we can further that push into curriculum and into action outside of the university, into the wider world and with our networks. So again, I'm really grateful to be here and to have that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing in, you know, the theological and spiritual roots of this, you know, this schism and this fracture, which is, you know, very much at the heart of what we need to address and the work that we have to do. So, Reverend Mohop, on that note, you've been involved with Green Faith for quite some time, so I would love to hear about how you hear the cry of the earth.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone on this panel. I started taking notes about what each of you are saying, because it's such a gift to realize that you don't have to cover everything, that each of us are bringing in a thread to this discussion and definition. and that together our definitions and experiences and hearing of the cry of the earth together, that we hear a fuller chorus of what it really is. So thanks to each of you. I'm thinking particularly of how we've lifted up white supremacy and the role in dehumanizing particularly bodies of color and humans of color, that many of my colleagues on this panel have lifted up. The way in which the earth is a living being, that we've worsened our pollution and worsened our use of material in order to have faster everything. What I'm thinking about from our context at Green Faith, where we're an international interfaith organization, is how all of our faith teaches us that killing our planet is wrong, and that we can rely on those religious teachings to remember that we have our faith at our back as we turn into the crisis and hear the multitudes of these definitions. And I'm also thinking about Leonardo Boff's book, Cry of the Earth. And the second part of that title is Cry of the Poor. So Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, and thinking about how people who've been colonized and marginalized all over the world, who are economically disadvantaged systematically by the world's governments and systems, that they are so often people of color, and so often are the people who have already experienced the worst impacts of climate change all over the planet. And they're also the people around the world who are beginning to find the solutions and who have been rising up to demand action. And so I'm here thinking on this panel about what it means for those of us who have a lot of privilege, white privilege, economic privilege, gender privilege, religious privilege. What does it mean for us to use that privilege to be in solidarity as we face the climate crisis? And it, again, comes back to the fact that all of us are bringing in voices and experiences into this so that we can better hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.
Thank you. So bringing in a very interesting policy thread and dimension, I'll invite Jeff to answer this question about how you understand the climate crisis. What about the cry of the earth has driven you in this work for so long? As we're discussing spiritual and economic and historical dimensions, we I think understand that we have to figure out how to make these policy changes and how to make them as effective as they can be in the appropriate amount of time, and what a challenge that is. So Jeff, I will welcome your thoughts and experience in that area.
Well, thank you, Jennifer and Ryan, and it's really a treat to be here with all of you. I do feel a little bit unqualified as not a theologian. I should add for folks watching, I'm a member of the board of Union for the past couple of years, and really one of the things that I am looking forward to is more of these types of interactions and building as much communication as we can between students and the board, and working on these very difficult issues. So really appreciate that. I do come out of a policy background, but the root cause of my work in the environment is at, I don't know, 25, 6, I said, how am I going to find meaning in my life? What am I going to do to find meaning? And I decided to devote my life to making the environment a better place. And when you're in the policy world, it's tricky because sometimes you have to take half a loaf, and that's not always what you want to do, but you always can. My career, I've always been able to live to fight again, and I think I'm pretty optimistic right now, and this is such a change from last January or November, shall we say. And there's a lot of positive energy, and especially coming out of this administration, climate issues are being woven throughout the entire policy portfolio. And, on an international basis, re-entering the Paris Agreement and demonstrating United States leadership. It's key. I mean, because right now, the United States, we generate basically 15% of worldwide carbon emissions. We could go to zero and we're still going to have a crisis. So we have to have the leadership. We have to be helping countries around the world install new technologies, cope with, in my mind, the climate crisis is really a social justice crisis. It's interwoven with poverty and discrimination. And we have to conquer all these crises at the same time to get at climate. Problems like deforestation, overfishing, things like that around the world are intricately linked to resource depletion and poverty. And so we have to have that vision. For me, the climate crisis, it's a huge behavioral change experiment, okay, that we can't afford to lose. Or failure is not an option. The planet will survive, okay? The planet has gone through various crises and extinction crises over the time. The way it is today will not, unless we have behavioral change across the board. And we have to be, and this is where I think Union can play such a positive role, is we have to be educating people to say, yes, you as individuals can help make change, that this problem is not so overwhelming that there's nothing you can do. And there's a defeatist attitude in a lot of people, oh, there are 50 right whales left in the world, so what? There's nothing I can do about that. Well, there are things. And so we have to constantly be looking at those things where we can inspire people to remain optimistic, to change behavior, and to say that, it's not acceptable that we locate our most polluting industries, coal and gas, in the poorest neighborhoods. I mean, there is, and we can get at this later, but there's such a direct connection between the COVID crisis and what the populations most affected by that and environmental discrimination. So we have to conquer those issues. I think I'll stop there, but I want to just say that as we get into the nuts and bolts of this, I hope to be a resource.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for highlighting more of those more dimensions of how intersectional this crisis is. Dean Cooper White, I would love to hear, I know you've heard the cry of the earth for quite some time, so I would love to hear what it sounds like to you and how it sort of guides your vision for our response here at Union.
Thanks, Jennifer. Much has been said that I have been thinking is important, so I'm not going to repeat things that other people have said, but I have several associations of this that go to different parts of my life, I guess, that I thought of when I thought about the cry of the earth. The earliest one was in high school, which was in the 1971, 2, 3. We had an ecology club, and it was mostly made up of sort of the most liberal Jewish and Protestant kids who, we they wore blue jeans, and we wore, all the tassels and everything that went along with that era. And the picture in the yearbook showed us all lying on the lawn of the school, looking very close to the earth. And that was probably my first introduction to the issue. But at that time, there was so much we still didn't know. And Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, I think, actually came out a bit after that. But we knew there was a crisis, but what we didn't understand, I think, at that time was how that crisis was so completely inseparably interwoven with racism and issues of poverty and oppression of peoples. We thought it was about, fixing stuff like changing light bulbs or whatever. And we were so earnest, but there was so much that we still had to learn. But that's just to say that, those of us who are working in this movement at all right now, we have shoulders that we're standing on from people who were working in this movement many decades back. And so we're not inventing a new thing, but I think that we're learning a lot about what it really means, and both the science and the sociology of what it really means. A second association I have is that I was a part of signing on to a Green Seminary initiative that was thought up by an evangelical Christian doctor who thought that people in seminaries ought to be studying this and committing themselves to this. It wasn't green faith. And it was the best that my seminary at that time was willing to do. But I think it was a lot more about cloth napkins and getting better light bulbs and making, personal changes in the home and encouraging congregations to make those changes, which are, yes, it is the Seminary Stewardship Alliance. Thank you. I couldn't come up with the right name. And so it was an effort to bring evangelical seminaries and liberal seminaries together under the banner of this. But what I also found disturbing, and when they asked all of us as signers to do a little video for posterity, I said, this is all really great, but until we address corporate complicity and until we address the issues of eco-justice, we are not really doing anything but the tip of the iceberg. And the group, because it was so theologically diverse, did not really want to dive into the issues of racism or even theologies around the denigration of the body and bodies as related to this, because that would have upset the apple cart in terms of our being able to talk to each other about climate. So we kind of kept to the most basic, nice things to do. So I had been encouraging them to join Green Faith, and Green Faith is, for me, a model of making that connection, which we did make at the Center for Women and Religion at the Graduate Theological Union years ago. The next thing that I think about is just, I want to read you this passage, something that just pierced me recently. It had to do with the whale that was found in the Outer Hebrides back in December of 2019. And this is a quote from the New York Times article. The debris had formed a huge ball in the stomach. This whale had a huge, vast amount of plastic in its stomach. And it included, quote, bundles of rope, plastic cups, bags, gloves, packing straps, and tubing. There was something about the pathos of that image that just made me think about our addiction to plastic in particular. And again, I want us, in my home, I want us to use less and less plastic. And a number of my friends are trying to do that with beeswax wraps and all these things. But we can all do that as much as we can. But until corporations and industries stop manufacturing plastic, we're still going to be able to indulge our addiction to it because it represents convenience. So plastic is one of my particular nemeses. And my last two comments, one has to do with something that I talked about with the folks at the Center for Earth Ethics about the psychology of climate denial. And I think I think climate denial goes hand in hand with domination and control, and domination as a response to threat, which is also very characteristic of whiteness. You feel threatened, you try to dominate whatever it is that's threatening to you. And so domination of the earth is, or denial of climate crisis is a really existential expression of, I don't want to look at that, I don't want to see that, I'm just going to try to control everything myself, and I'd rather not know the truth about that. So I think in spite of all the rhetoric that comes out of politics, right-wing politics, that reinforces that, there's a deeper internal desire not to know it. And all of us, to some extent, I think, have to battle that internal desire not to know how catastrophic this can become. And then finally, theologically, I just immediately was thinking of Sally McFaig's book, written back in 1993, called The Body of God, which I still think is one of the best feminist theological books out there. And the point she makes in this book is that bodies matter. Bodies matter to God. God is the body that is the earth, that is the universe, that is the world. And if we start thinking in terms of, rather than looking at abstract theological propositions and doctrines and things that have very little connection to embodied life, if we begin to look at bodies and the earth as God's body, we begin to see that the language of savages and primitivity, which ties the bodies of persons of color and also women to the earth, and all of that to be subjugated and denigrated. Instead, if we honor and value and worship a God who is embodied in this world, it's completely compatible with the incarnation of Christian theology, but certainly many other religious traditions as well. And we need to start revering the earth that has birthed us. So I'll end with that.
And that's quite the ending. Thank you so much. And the beginning. I think we're going to try to guide the conversation now over to thinking about Union's context and how in this Community Mobilization Action Plan, or CMAP, how we're trying to both like work with these issues, grasp some really grassroots and I think grasp these issues by the theological roots, by the social roots, and how we're both like how we learn them, how we engage with them, how we embody them in our both in our academic community, in our faith communities, and our neighborhood. So I think beginning with Petra, just always just really astounded by your work thinking of the doctrine of discovery in particular. I think that's one of the most like this what we've been dancing around and talking about and addressing the deep theological roots of our current crisis, particularly in an expression of Christianity. Can you, for our audience, maybe tell us about this doctrine of discovery, and also for our community assembly participants, how we as an educational community, as a theological community, can begin unlearning kind of like the remnants of this doctrine of discovery that might have survived in our own theological thinking, but also how we can start imagining new things and learning older ways as well that have always been around.
Okay. Yes, talking about the doctrine of discovery is so important. I feel that it is our origin tale. It is the origin tale of Christian domination. And I had the opportunity to learn about the doctrine of discovery. I'll make this short, though I won't go into that so much. But it's really a DVD by Steve Newcomb, who's an Indigenous law scholar. And I happened to be listening to WBAI. I had a very long commute and I was able to listen to this, and it just struck me that this is where it comes from. This is the origin tale of what we suffer from. And so we may all be familiar with learning certainly about the Spanish Inquisition, 1452. And at that time, the Moors were expelled from Spain, as were Jews. They were clearing them away, torturing them really, because they were not Christian. They were clearing Spain away in order to make it a purely Christian nation. And those who remained were forced to be baptized. And so in 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued this edict, which was a papal bull. Papal bull was Dum Diversus. And this papal bull was issued to the King of Portugal, King Alphonse, to go into West Africa. And the directive was to invade, capture, pursue, vanquish all pagans, Saracens, and enemies of Christ, and to put them into perpetual enslavement, taking all of their possessions and all of their lands. That's a lot of domination. So that directive, and that was in order to be able to interrupt the trade routes, because the Africans, West Africans, were very successful in their trade routes. And so this was in order to interrupt those trade routes, to take from them what it was that they were being successful at. And so from that time, there were perhaps 5 other papal bulls that were issued. And certainly the papal bull that was also issued the year that Columbus came back, 1493, which was Inter Cartera, which helped to divide Spain and Portugal, not to fight with each other, but to fight against those infidels, those non-Christians. And so these directives really very similar in terms of what it was that they were demanding, how Christian nations were to interact with each other, and how they were to treat those who were non-Christian. Now, Christianity was initially the focus of this. However, it really became, after natives were baptized, it became really to support not Christianity, but to support whiteness. And so we see that it changes over time. And so this is the origin tale of why we see white supremacy and race evolving. And so the Christian nations, the monarchs of Europe, saw that there was, after Columbus's so-called discovery, saw that there was this large landmass that of course meant new land. And if these are non-Christian people, well, it's theirs for the taking. And so they felt that their superior genius would allow them to take the land, expel those who were on it, because they had not built it up in the same way that Europe had been built up. So clearly they were not using the gifts of the land as they should have been. So that is really the origin tale. Now, when you get to Columbus, his first act was to come off of his ship, take his sword, which is again in the shape of a cross, and plunge it into the earth in something of a ritual act, and baptize the earth. He baptizes the earth and names it in the name, and honors it in the name of the Savior, and calls it San Salvador, and says that this is also in honor of the King and Queen of Spain, the monarchs who had financed his journey. So, you know, the land was baptized first. And then after the land was baptized, after a while, the indigenous people were forced. They didn't realize that it was what it actually meant, but they were forced to be baptized. And that was a way also of beginning to dominate them. It was part of the ritual of domination. The land was baptized, the people were baptized into domination, into being dominated. What can we do in order to be able to address this domination code? This domination code exists because really it exists because we don't know our own history. It exists because we do not tell the truth of what it is that we really have in mind for other people. This doctrine of discovery and how it came about is not necessarily being taught as such. And there's a problem in that, because if we don't really know that origin tale, then we are more likely to be repeating it. So I think that the first thing is for us to tell the truth about the doctrine of discovery, how it emanated really out of those who were in using their power as religious leaders and using it to corrupt in an authoritarian manner, which was absolutely what happened. So, knowing that and teaching that, having people be aware of what that is, I think that allows us to be able to say we will not be repeating that history, because now at least we know it. And it allows us to operate differently because we have an awareness. I think that that's critical.
Thank you so much for that very concise history of a large topic and a very important topic. By the way, I've turned off my video because my internet has gone unstable. But following up, I think, Al, just thinking, what, as an institution, as a historically Christian seminary that has recently begun becoming an interfaith seminary, what does right relationship look like between a seminary and indigenous communities, particularly those on the front line of these struggles? Do you have any thoughts about that and what we should be considering and what best practices we could be learning from to begin engaging in right relationship to both indigenous communities
so this
and the
is a
land?
question for me about how we can relate in a better way.
Yes.
Okay, I'm cutting off my video because the internet is unstable. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think this is a really good expression. Ramapo's relationship with the Union Theological Seminary has really been quite good. I mean, I like the exchanges we've had with people coming to our lands and us coming to seminary. So I think it really comes down to getting into right relation with each other and the earth itself. I mean, I have to admit, when I sometimes reflect on the civil rights movement about integration, I have to think to myself, well, Black people, people of African descent were always integrated from day one. It was reintegration. I think what Dr. King was the vision was a new relationship. It's not that there was no relationship before. It was a bad one. So I'm really glad to hear Patriot Holmes, Reverend Holmes's exposition on the Doctrine of Discovery. Yes, I think it really is a hugely important issue to look at, because the past isn't just past. It's I think the Latin American writer Carlos Fuentes said the past is always with us. We don't recognize it for what it is, which is memory. So it's not that our past is not connected to where we are now. It's something that informs where we're at right now. So in terms of getting into right relation, I mean, I think sometimes it's funny how our minds are trained, or let's say that the dominant narrative, or let's say the loudest voices want to remember certain things and don't want to remember other things, and even in different spheres, because I was shocked when I heard that in Haiti, they were paying an indemnity to France for getting their independence, I think up until maybe even the 1970s. No one in France was saying, oh, that happened like, years ago, we need to move on, that kind of thing. And I mean, even Germany, I think the Versailles Treaty, I think they were still paying reparations, or there was some sort of payment arrangements that were made even up until the 21st century. So I just find it fascinating that these institutions seem to have a long-term memory in ways that maybe people don't quite recognize. So I think, it's to me, it's not a situation of, say, with the church and Ramapo, our experience in that it's something of the past, but it's really coming into a better relationship with the churches and going forward, all of us in a good way, because the issues that we're facing with climate change and nuclear arms and destruction and technology, it's nothing that no one community can take on by itself. It's going to take all of us together to go forward in a good way. So I think that there's a lot that we can learn from each other and going forward in a good way. And in events where, we have people coming to our lands and us coming to Union Theological Seminary, I think that's the path forward. I hope that
so much.
answers the question.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much, Al. And Reverend Rich, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. Just thinking, as Union seeks to mobilize and transform the seminary into an ecologically resilient and just institution, what are just best practices that we should be thinking about as both as a community member in Upper Manhattan and Harlem, but also in developing our own community along this just transition framework? What are best practices? What should we be considering before anything else?
Good question. I think I want to build the answer to your question off of Petra's earlier comments. And by that, I want to lift up the idea of baptism. One of the last things Petra referenced was how the land was baptized and the people were baptized. Well, with that, I'm thinking to myself, baptism within the Christian tradition, it speaks to us, or the confessing person being baptized into the death and resurrection of Jesus. But I'm wondering, off of the heels of what Petra has said, does there exist another baptism? And by that, I mean a baptism into white colonization. And I think one of the first steps is, as to a faithful practice, is to consider what kind of baptism we are giving. Is it a baptism into a salvific power, or is it a baptism into a kind of colonization? That's the first thing. We really have to answer that. But then secondly, when we consider some best practices, the term community is often thrown around, and I think that's done to our detriment, because what do we mean by that term? And so I think at some basic levels, we need to really consider some working definitions of what do we mean when we say community. Am I within this community? Does it mean that I get to project upon others, or does it mean that I am in conversation with others? So working through kind of the dynamics of what we mean when we say community. Is this a community that really is inclusive for those who are, excuse me, for those who identify as gay or lesbian or queer? Is this a community for those who are differently abled? What do we really mean when we say this? taking into account that as well. I think that's important. And the reason why I bring that up is because when we start to raise the question, or answer the question at least, about who are we in community, who is our neighbor, then it gets us to actually beginning to work with our neighbor and thinking about the ways in which we include our neighbors. And so that means that any work that an institution engages surrounding eco-justice or climate would entail being in conversation and a working relationship with their neighbor. Again, who is our neighbor, though? I think digging deep to answer that question really matters. So who else is coming to the table? What are our objectives? What are our objectives in this conversation? And what might their objectives be? Also, I'd like to think of what ghosts are coming with us as well. And so by that, I mean this. I am of the firm belief that any conversation, anytime you show up somewhere, you are not showing up there alone, but you come with a host of ancestors. And I think it behooves us to really think through what it means for our ancestors to be in the room together. What might it mean for me to bring in my ancestors who were enslaved and someone else who enslaved them? That pervades the background of the conversation as well. So before we even get down to actually a working practice, there's some other ideological and I think theological work that we need to do. There's some other questions that we really need to wrestle with and answer, and do that hard work. Once we've done all of that, then again, these working sessions, if you will, with conversations like this, and also conversations that include a socioeconomically diverse mix, conversations that include representatives of different institutions. And so in the area where Union is, who makes up that context? Who are the voices there? The preachers, the imams, the leaders, the teachers, the students even, and not just the students of Union, but the students of the local high school, all the folks who filled that place, who occupied that place, that area. It matters. It matters that they have an opportunity to voice in these conversations. And now we can talk about the particulars of that and say, well, Reverend Rich, this, if you bring too many people to the table, then it's far more difficult to actually come to a consensus. Okay, I hear that. So then let's talk about some structures here. So then maybe it means identifying the representatives of these groups. Okay, but there's a politic in that too. And so essentially what I'm getting at is, overarchingly, there has to be some work that is done at the individual level to answer these questions surrounding neighbor, surrounding what it means to be in community, who has access to our community, what are the politics, what the religious underpinnings here, and then who gets a seat at this table, who gets to say, to have words here, and who do they represent? And furthermore, are they an accurate representation of those people? Best practices. I'm going to get off that because that I feel like I'm digging deeper than I think we might want to go there. But let me go to some other concrete things. So, what does it mean for us to consider zoning and planning, kind of the more tangible things? Okay, the zoning, planning, air rights. One of the things that I did want to raise in this conversation is how are we considering lead practices even? through the United States Green Bill Council. They have this LEED certification, that deals with water and energy efficiency. What are our practices looking like? Because historically, what we have seen, and I'm glad Jeff is here to talk more about the policy, but overwhelmingly, we have seen policy that has been used as a means of discrimination. Policy itself has been used as a means to continue white supremacy. And time does not permit me to go into the laws which have, the laws on the books, which have actually supported things like segregated housing. And so, succinctly, let me say that first doing the work, that more kind of ideological, theological work, and then getting into those practices, construction materials and zoning, planning, and even that has its own politic. Who sits on those boards? How are we engaged in conversations with them? How is money even being transacted to get things done that may be in the advantage or to the advantage of one institution, but actually may suppress another institution? This is complicated. There's really no, I'm sorry, Ryan, there's really no direct answer to say, first do this, then this, then this. But rather it is a complicated mixture. And that is in part why the CMAT model is so important, because it gets us to bringing all of these various constituents to the table to have this conversation and to build from there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer to a complicated question, and I think you spoke really well to it. And it seems setting the table, getting ready to have the conversation is so much of the work of mobilizing, and saying that you're mobilizing in a just transition framework. And and with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jennifer. We can continue on asking more questions.
Thank you. Reverend Rich, you brought up so much. I wish we had all night to even just begin to unpack, the many layers here. But something that you sort of raised for me, and one of the things that I think is, one of the most immediate and probably ongoing dimensions of this work is for us to understand our identity and our responsibilities as not only a faith institution, but as a moral and ethical leader and a community partner, both within our immediate community and the impact that we have globally, and sort of imagining and continuing to imagine what does that mean for our role in the climate crisis, and what does that mean for our responsibility to our communities. So with that in mind, I would love to ask Reverend Mohop, how do you think we should articulate the sort of imagined just transition, both in words and action, as a faith institution?
I think you should start from a place of faith. At Green Faith, we ask, in our fellowship program, we have 60 fellows from all over the world and from lots of different traditions and faith experiences. And look, I've gotten to hear Reverend Rich talk about policy and zoning multiple times, and every time I just think, whoa, that's brilliant. And I understand a third of that because it's not my field, right? And I'm so grateful for people who are in the zoning, urban planning / theology world that can do that intersection. And I think about like Jeff's policy versus and environment and that intersection, that's that particular intersection. And I think where Union is at those two intersections, and also the intersection and the vocation of living out an ecological faith. And so thinking about just transition, thinking about responding to climate emergency, climate crisis, really digging into our religious resources. So let me go back to the fellows. So we have 60 fellows from all over the world. And the first thing we get them to do is to write their eco-spiritual autobiography. And it takes a month. One could argue that you would need years. And in fact, brilliant minds have spent their whole lives trying to articulate that eco-spiritual autobiography, how our faith is connected to caring for the earth, connected to the life of the planet. But we ask them to do it in a month. And then we teach them how to organize as people of faith to respond to climate and environmental injustices and to really call for just transition. But we do that from a place of founding, building that foundation in faith. And kind of this like deep understanding that, oh, this is what we have in common, that our faiths, no matter where we are in the world, no matter what we believe, there's this like common core thing. And what's beautiful is that all of our like religious traditions and like geographical context add like texture and like rabbit holes to go down and to learn from. But that core is what we share in common. And some of us will bring in other intersections, right? Which makes, again, this conversation much more beautiful and powerful. So that's the first thing, starting from a place of faith as you think about just transition. And then thinking about power and the power that Union holds as an institution, but as an institution of people of faith. That people of faith have been powerful witnesses in social movements, always. And that Union is a part of that history and also a part of that present. And then thinking through, so religious, looking at just transition through the lens of faith, then looking at it from a place of power as people of faith. And then third, thinking about how calling for a just transition requires reparation. It requires how we think about financing fossil fuels and just recovery. It thinks about how we engage all the other intersections that have already been lifted up. That ecological justice is connected to social justice, and requires us really preparing a different way of being in the world, where a just transition is possible because we've invested in the like larger social and systemic systems that make the world more just. And we talk about just transition in Green Faith as part of the 10 demands that we organize around Green Faith, really seeing that each thing that we need to create eco-justice and climate justice in the world is connected to a lot of other things. And I'll put those demands in the chat so that everyone can see how just transition fits into the rest.
Thank you. Karena, I know you've sort of been working at this intersection, for quite some time, and at the center and sort of like modeling what this blueprint looks like for, bringing together the work of like faith and policy and research, for justice in all of these different areas. So I would love to hear, more about your vision, for that just transition, and what you imagine Union especially contributing to that as an institution.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And just to say, everybody here has said something fascinating or brilliant or both, and I'm really grateful for all that's been shared. I want to, in answering that question, Jennifer, back up for a second, just for those that may not know the history of the Center for Earth Ethics, just to say that I went to Union sort of midlife, mid-career, and I graduated with an MA in 2013. And I had a job called Director of Union Forum, which was a more general job working on public programming and so on. And this was the year that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations, he called a climate summit. We've just had another round of climate summit, and it's very important. But this one was in 2014. It was, remember, this was before we had the Paris Agreement. It was before Pope Francis wrote Laudato Si. There was a feeling that the previous talks had failed in Copenhagen. People were wondering where religious voices were, although there were some, let's be clear. It wasn't as prominent. And so we organized, in my general job that I got right after graduating from Union, there was just the right time and the right place to organize this conference called Religions for the Earth. And actually Green Faith, I want to shout out Green Faith, and thank you, Reverend Mohop, for all your work, but was a very close partner on that conference. So we had Religions for the Earth to reframe climate change as a moral issue, to galvanize faith-based activism, to confront it. And then the center really grew out of that conference. And we were technically launched in 2015. Just to give that context. So I did not have a life plan, nor did I have a background in nonprofit management or anything like that to start this center. It really grew organically out of being in the time and place. And that includes Union, because as every student at Union knows, liberation theologies, social gospel theologies, the sense of the change that's possible that we saw in the civil rights movement when faith leaders really take that prophetic role in society, when it becomes a moral issue, is just so powerful. And so I had been sitting in classrooms at Union and absorbing all of this. And when we organized the conference, a lot of Union students helped. And so it really came out of Union, and the center really comes out of Union. And so I want to say that I think that we have a ways to go. We've sort of workshopped various classes. Owl, thank you so much for your kind words. Being in partnership with the Ramapo Lenape has just been wonderful. Thank you for coming into our classrooms and our public programs and being so gracious and just maintaining those relations in such a good way. And Petra was our field ed student, the first field ed student that we had, unusually had such an advanced and sophisticated career as a teacher already brought knowledge of the Doctrine of Discovery as she has voiced. And she hosted screenings of this film, and we had discussions around the Doctrine of Discovery. And so we've been working in three ways: these education, public programming, and movement building. And we've done a little bit of each. The basic philosophy is to make what happens in the academy intelligible and accountable to what's happening on the front lines and the grassroots, and to have that go back and forth so we really make change. And I think in terms of just transition, I want to flag, it's not really a flag, just to say that term, we had a program called Economy, Ecology, and Ethics, Mobilizing for a Just Transition. Actually, Reverend Fletcher Harper was on it. It was years ago, as well as Oren Lyons of Onondaga, and Mary Evelyn Tucker, and Elizabeth Yampierre of Uprose. And it was a great program. But in the process, it was flagged to me that using the phrase just transition, you have to understand that there are different ways it's been used. And some people say it, and they mean basically that coal miners and people who've worked in the fossil fuel industry need to be retrained for new jobs and given new jobs. We can't just leave these people out. For other people, it's obviously much deeper, and it has to do with, we don't want to recreate systems. We don't want renewable energy systems to also be top down and exploitative and oppressive. We want a just transition that really takes care of people in terms of flipping the leadership of who's in control. So solar co-ops and so on. I think for Union to really act in the best of our tradition and to lead into a just transition, we should be really thinking more in partnership with our community, with Harlem, with Upper Manhattan, with the environmental justice hotspots that are nearby, which is, almost always higher asthma rates, where there are bus depots. And we have done some of that, but I think we can do more, and we can do it better, where we actually become a convening place where those issues are aired and we're really talking freely about them. And then of course we need to have more of the course offerings, including on the faculty level. I'm just an amateur, I'm not really an academic. And it's been wonderful to work at Union and work with other academics to make these offerings. But now we have a whole field, and we have people that we should invite in. I think we should have more faculty. We have a great faculty, don't get me wrong, there are already a lot of offerings, but it'll be exciting to grow and change with this ecology climate topic in mind. So those are some thoughts that I have. And then I just want to mention at the end, because I liked the way Reverend Rich mentioned Jeff when he was talking about facilities. And I know that that's something we should probably pick up on, because I think that the issues are complicated. Not all of us are experts on it, but we can really understand some things, such as, there are things we put out of sight, out of mind, like plastic use and so on. And it's hard to get it right. It's hard, but once we make that transition, it's kind of like when everybody was smoking in restaurants and movie theaters and airplanes, it seemed normal. And then afterwards, it's like, wow, we can't believe we actually allowed that, right? So I think we'll get there with things like single-use plastics, and we can lead through just transition with that as well. And keep in mind that it's not just an issue of sustainability in terms of the trash that piles up, it's also environmental justice, because where these plastics are produced are largely, we know in Louisiana, Cancer Alley, there's a petrochemical plant going in there. We know the oil and gas industry is strategizing to go deeper into plastics because of losing to renewables in the market. So this is a sampling of issues, but I'm very energized by this conversation and excited to explore it further.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that perfect segue into infrastructure issues, because I would love to ask both Jeffrey and Dean Cooper-White what you both think from an infrastructural perspective, what the biggest challenges and opportunities for Union might be in pursuing the CMAP goals that we have laid out so far.
Maybe, Jeff, I should go first, since I have a smaller domain, and then
Okay.
Whatever I don't address, you can fill in with. You have more of the overview of the whole institution as a board member. But I can say from the academic side, this is actually really timely, this conversation, because as some of you may know, we are just in the process of starting up a new entirely online Master's in Social Justice, which will be a 36 credit, or theoretically 1 year, including a summer. Probably most people doing this would do it part-time over more than that. But in the process of developing the curriculum for that, and all of the courses are open to every student at Union. So if you're in the MA in social justice, you have to take certain courses in certain areas, but anybody at Union can take these courses. And along with some others, I was insistent that eco-justice be one of the concentrations or pathways that someone could focus on in that MA. And so as we were developing the MA, we were looking at we asked all of the faculty to propose a course that would fit in the broad category of an online course for an MA in social justice. And we got a ton of course proposals from people. Some courses that would be adapted from existing courses, but many newly conceived. And I just want to quickly run down some of the ones that would immediately flow into that particular concentration. Anybody who knows Claudio Carvalhais knows that this has become his passion project for the rest of his life. He had a kind of conversion experience on his last sabbatical in various parts of the world, and he believes that it is absolutely the most important issue, and without addressing this issue, we can't address any issues. So every course he teaches, actually, he embeds quite a serious commitment to eco-justice, but in particular, he's offering a course called Extractivism, a Ritual Liturgical Response. And he's already taught that once and will continue to. We have a new chaplaincy concentration, and we're going to have a course on movement chaplaincy, which I actually thought, among other movements, we should be paying attention to training chaplains to be movement chaplains with the eco-justice movement. David Carr wants to teach Bible Beyond Humans, Biblical Construal of Animals. And Brigitte Kahl wants to teach Bible and Eco-Justice. John Tatamanel wants to teach Theology and the Natural World. And if I actually looked at so many of these that are listed and others in our curriculum, there are many ways in which I think it would be not difficult at all to put eco-justice in the syllabus along with other justice-oriented concerns that courses address. I do think the most important thing to keep at the forefront as we plan courses as a faculty is, well, just to give you a note of background, there was a hate incident on our campus last week, which was devastating to the whole community. And while Union wants to be an anti-racist institution, I think that incident and the response of people to it has galvanized deeper commitments among faculty to interrogate themselves about the ways in which Union has been and continues to be a white and racist institution in spite of our rhetoric, right? And so the faculty has made some deeper commitments to really embed anti-racism work in all of our committee work next year and everything that we are thinking about in terms of our syllabi and our curriculum, and also improving student care and support. So what I think is that we can't put these two very, very important issues in competition with each other as if they were separate, because they're clearly not separate, and that anti-racism work is also eco-justice work, and eco-justice work, if it's going to be more than a Band-Aid approach, has to be attentive to the ways in which we have destroyed the land on which Indigenous people live and people of color, and that we put our trash on those lands. And in some ways, we equate BIPOC people with the land that we can simply exploit them both. So I don't see these issues as competing for time and energy. I see them intertwined, and that's something we have to strive for in our whole curriculum.
You want me to jump in?
Yeah, please.
Okay, let me just, I know we want time for questions, but just a couple of things. One thing on just transition, where I think thinkers at Union would be very helpful to policymakers, is the role of technology. For example, if we had the ability through geoengineering to stop sea level rise, to preserve island nations, should we? Things like that. What is the role of nuclear power if indeed our problem is carbon? Should we endorse micronuclear plants, which is a thing? And I'm not an expert there, but there are a whole lot of these types of issues that we are going to be facing because, if you take the pessimistic view of human nature, we won't deal with problems till the last minute. And at that point, what will we do? So anyway, that's just if we can sort of start to think about those things now, we might get ahead of the ball. From a sort of purely physical plant kind of what can Union do? We have an old historic facility, and that has many challenges and limitations. And I think we shouldn't beat ourselves up if we can't get to a certain level of efficiency because we can't replace our windows with double pane windows because of historic preservation issues, or that solving one problem might bring out an asbestos issue or a lead paint issue that could cause the cure could be worse than the problem. So I think it's wildly complicated. I began part of my career launching the Energy Star program and getting companies to convert to fluorescent bulbs. Well, in retrospect, if we had skipped fluorescent and just gone to LED, we wouldn't have had a mercury in fluorescent bulb problem. At the time, we were saving energy, but we also created a solid waste problem. And so you have to have a very humble approach when you are looking at these facilities issues, and hopefully many of you will go out and possibly be managing congregations in historic buildings and wrestling with many of these same things. So the more training we can provide, the better. I do think the things that we can stress are the behavioral change aspects. Things like once you start composting your food waste at home, it is impossible to stop. Take it from me. It becomes one of those things where you are carting banana peels around because you realize that that is something that can have another life and something useful. If Union can start a composting program, it probably has to feed into what is available, because in general the city has certain parameters, but I think that would be terrific. A lot of the material goals in the plan make a lot of sense. I do think life cycle analysis is in its infancy in so many ways. And, you can say we want, only sustainably sourced timber, but if that timber comes by truck versus rail, then you've lost a whole lot of your ecological benefit. And so it's very tricky. And I think one of the first things we need to do is probably an energy audit. And, that way we have some sort of baseline. We're going to have a lot of limitations because we've just spent millions of dollars renovating Hastings. And as many of you know, the power plant essentially in Hastings and the water and everything is responsible for the entire facility. And it's been significantly upgraded. And so we're going to automatically, compared to, 2 years ago, have enormous savings there. But what you can do after that becomes a question of technological limitation. If anybody toured the physical plant when it was being renovated, the costs underground or in the basement level were probably as much as everything above ground. It was just unbelievable amounts of work there. But really, I think the architects did. I'm not an architect, and I wasn't there, so I'm pretty sure a lot of it was LEED certified. And but I'd have to, get back to you, Reverend Rich, on that, on all those factors. But that was certainly a role. I think one more thing I want to say about, well, two things. One is Union is always faced with a cost benefit analysis. I mean, there are seminaries closing all around the country. In some ways, the most ecological thing would be to close the seminary entirely and no one would be there. Well, we don't want to do that. And how we stored our financial resources is incredibly important because, that's the future students and future thinkers will depend on that. So we're always mindful of that trade-off, and we do not have this unlimited endowment. The endowment is shrinking every year. And, if you ask me, I'd rather have one more student in being enrolled with a lot of financial aid than anything else. That is, I think, our sort of guidestone and top priority is to keep enrollment strong and what we can do there. Last thing I want to say is on the behavior change, again, stressing that is we need to inspire active democratic citizens, because a lot of the problems we are discussing are structural in nature and policy in nature. The subsidization of the fossil fuel industry is not a mistake, and it's not something we individually can solve, but collectively we might be able to. Solar and wind should be way more affordable than oil and gas. And so much of the sort of tax credits go right into the profit bottom line. So we have to deal with that. So teaching people and on how you can change public policy. And so the connections that Union has with Washington, I think, are incredibly important and need to be strengthened. And a lot of organizations in the faith community are playing a very positive role. And I've gotten some reasonably good feedback that this administration is viewing, unlike previous administration, the faith community is not, how to put this delicately, it's involves the left as well as the right, I'll put it that way. And so that it is very much aware that it has allies and that it needs to reach out on things like climate and equity and social justice to the faith community as well. So I'm sure there's a lot of detail on things that Union can do on its physical plant. It would be great to have 100% renewable power. That's going to be a question of what's available and how we do that. And do we buy electrons from, do we have the supply, and can we do that? And does that make sense? So that's why I think an energy audit would be a great first step. But with that, I'll stop.
Thanks, Jeff. And that is one of the places that we are starting. It's one of the first goals of our CMAP is just do an audit, lots of audits, waste audit, energy audit, water audit, just to see where we're at. And I guess also where we're at now is we are getting towards the end of our panel here. And would ask that if you have any questions, I see a few raised hands in the audience. I'm not sure exactly what to do with those because I don't think I can invite you onto this screen where we're at. So I would ask that you put your question in either the chat or the Q&A section, which is down at the bottom of your menu bar. And we already have a few questions from our audience here. And I'll just start from the top here, and maybe Jennifer and I can alternate between asking questions. And the first one is for Petra, which says, Petra, can you comment on braiding sweetgrass and the indigenous values of the earth that book represents, if you're familiar or know that well?
Oh, it's so beautifully written. It allows you to leave your Western society and to step into, and she's very gentle in bringing you into the space that is an indigenous mindset. I'm remembering, I think one of my favorite parts, if I can find a favorite, is talking about how one should gather medicine, how one should forage for herbs. And, we must first ask. We must ask permission of that plant life. We must recognize it, ask permission, and wait for an answer. And then we are not to take the first. We are certainly never to take all. And we are only to take what is absolutely needed, and to make sure that we leave for the next one to have. It is so, she brings us into an understanding that is not where we have lived, but it deepens us. Just reading it is just brings you to a new consciousness about being immersed in the world around us. Beautifully written, again, as I said before, but that's that. And I would like to just actually find myself reviewing it. And from time to time, I do that because it's just, it's where we really want to be. It opens a whole world for us in terms of an understanding, a belief system, a consciousness, a culture that is not Western, that is, really indigenous thought, and very, very invaluable. Yes.
Thank you, Petra. Yeah, highly recommend reading that book for those that haven't. And the audiobook is read by the author herself, and it's such a gift. So this next question is from Nobuko Hori, whose question is in regards to the necessity of civil disobedience, and specifically what privileged people can or must put on the line in facing this crisis of unfathomable proportions. Historically and currently, through abolition, the civil rights movement, and current indigenous-led resistance to pipelines, people of African and indigenous heritage have been putting their bodies on the line for centuries to resist these forces of white supremacist destruction. As theologians, what is our responsibility to dig deep into Kingian principles of a nonviolent, beloved no to these capitalist forces enabled by our governments, causing revelations like destruction? As European descendants, what is our spiritual obligation, not only to engage with our minds and hearts, but also our bodies? And how long can we afford the privilege of not putting our bodies on the line while the subjugated descendants of those we have oppressed are the ones who have to do so for all of us? Which is an open question for anybody who would like to take that on.
Well, there was a lot in there. I'll take a crack at it unless somebody else. Okay, so just to start with, because civil disobedience is mentioned there, I think that that civil disobedience is a very important sort of field of thought to understand, even if you're not going to go get arrested yourself in some way, because first of all, we all saw in the civil rights movement, the freedom riders, the lunch counter sit-ins, defying injunctions to march, and we saw Rosa Parks, we saw Martin Luther King Jr. and others, and how that catalyzed change. And I think that one of the things about ethics and morals is that it's not there are times in history where a deep sense of right and wrong is out of step with both laws and social norms. And so that was true in the civil rights movement, and it's true today in the sense that the main drivers of ecological destruction are perfectly legal. So when we're talking about them, we're usually not talking about breaking the law. In fact, we're talking about usually a partnership between government and the private sector, like these fossil fuel pipelines that get permitted by the government to go through communities and take land, and then oil spills or the climate impacts come, and the rest of us have to bear the cost of what happens, but particularly the people who, as we've already said, are people who are largely people of color and people of low income. So when we're talking about civil disobedience, I think it's important to recognize that when laws and social norms are out of step with a deep sense of right and wrong, sometimes challenging by very transparently breaking a law in order to unmask and unveil how immoral that law is a real tool for social change. So there are multiple ways to engage in that. Not there are certain people who risk arrest, who get arrested in that kind of situation. And there are others who just preach about it, right? We're in a seminary. Let's not forget people are going to preach, right? And read Bible studies and so on. And you can also communicate and help others to understand the context of that. So in terms of there were other components to that question, but I think that civil disobedience is important because it has a lineage, a thought lineage that goes, I mentioned King, it obviously goes through Gandhi as well, Satyagraha, Ahimsa concepts, and it goes, of course, in some ways to Jesus, right? So, and there are multiple examples of people who have unmasked the violence of the system, as they say, in that way. So, and then the other thing is just in terms of people who bear privilege, what is our responsibility? I mean, I think everyone has a different calling. We're living in a time of reckoning, which is very important that we do it and we don't look away, reckoning with white supremacy, I mean. But we also, we're human beings and we don't always, we're not looking at everybody always through sociological lenses. We also recognize individuals have their own callings, their own set of gift, and we don't know what everybody's one is, right? So you can't say, why aren't you doing that? Or why aren't you doing that? Because that may not be their calling and their place. So I would just offer that as well. Thank you.
Any other quick follow-ups on nonviolence and the necessity of it in this moment and how we should engage with it?
Go ahead, Abby.
No. Daryl, no. Daryl, go ahead. No. I'll follow you.
Okay. Well, I wanted to chime in on this piece, particularly with respect to embodiment, because that is exactly what we saw when we look at the civil rights movement, particularly of the 1950s, 60s, Dr. King and associates putting their bodies in space. But it raises a larger question for us and a larger consideration, I think. And by that, I mean this: we have to really start to explore the ways in which space has been colonized. So space and place, how the two have been colonized, and the extent to which Black bodies traversing through space and or place is understood to be transgressive. And so here I'm thinking with Kelly Brown Douglas in her writing, Stand Your Ground. And what does it mean for a Black body or a person of color to occupy, walk through space, because there has been an inextricable connection between space and whiteness. So that's the first thing. Secondly, on the heels of that, I think we have to also start to deconstruct ideas surrounding space and place. And this work has been ongoing, but what I'm pushing for here is a furtherance of it. And I'm thinking here with Henry Lefebvre. I'm thinking here with Neil Brenner, an urbanist who talks about the social stratification, and particularly how living in how urban spaces come along with them this social stratification. And so, in light of Union, and in light of all of you who call that place home, as you all consider your forward movement with respect to the climate crisis, how are you also thinking through space and place? How are you thinking about the bodies which occupy that? Are they transgressive? And if so, why? Again, so I'm circling us back around to some of the basic questions that we need to answer. Who do we consider our neighbor? And why? I'm also thinking about what does it mean for the city to become a salvific place? And here I think I'm thinking with Carolyn Merchant and Barbara Rawson, you know, how can the city, I'm also thinking with Thomas Martin, how can the city become a salvific space for all colored bodies? Abby?
I wanted to go after you, Darrell, because I knew you'd be brilliant. But it's the other piece that I'm hearing that I just want to lift up is the struggle that has so often been placed on people of color to fight for millennia, and that people of color don't need white saviors, and they absolutely deserve that people who are white do the work so that they can take a deep breath and rest. And that there is a kind of responsibility to say to people of color, look, y'all don't have to do it by yourself, like that we do it together, that we do it intimately, like acknowledging that our work, our liberation is connected, right? Fannie Lou Hamer told us years and years ago that nobody's free until everybody's free. And that has to be about liberation and about like everyone's own power, right? And that we at Green Faith, we talk about power individually and institutionally and systemically, and that all of that power works together, and that civil disobedience is a way for those of us with power to say, it's not like, let's be in solidarity, knowing too that people without power have been engaging in civil disobedience just by existing in spaces that say only certain kinds of people get to have power.
Thank you. I think, so we have two really great and pointed questions in the chat, and I want to acknowledge both and ask one. One is about the 100 Claremont Lend-Lease, just how do we balance out gentrification, displacement, and climate apartheid, and thinking about this as an issue and as something that Union has to morally grapple with as we engage and address transition. And I would point that there's a town hall about the 100 Claremont Lend-Lease development coming up on the 28th, I believe, a town hall about that.
Actually, after the Student Senate leaders were with us yesterday in a small meeting, and also again in the faculty meeting, I think there's a good chance that April 28th forum will be more focusing on the recent hate incident.
Okay.
But as I've said before, I mean, I don't think we need to separate these issues, but I think it may end up being broader than just talking about the origins of the building project.
Okay, thank you so much.
Given the sense of urgency we've experienced in the community.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing it up. But I just want to know that is something that we are grappling with and thinking about, and we will continue to open up space for. And then the last question is about Chase Bank, which I would love to ask it out loud. So Chase Bank is currently bankrolling the destructive Enbridge Line 3 pipeline being built through Anishinaabe treaty lands in northern Minnesota, one of the many socially and environmentally destructive projects mega bank like Chase Fund, Union banks with Chase Bank. And Indigenous water protectors have called for divestment from Chase and its funds Lines 3. In the context of environmental racism and the catastrophic consequences of burning the tar sands Line 3 will transport, what can Union do to address its entanglement with Chase? And I will say that there are two demands in the CMAP. One is to stop banking with Chase, or coordinate with other faith institutions to write a very concerned and pointed letter demanding that they stop to divest from Line 3 and other extractive projects. So any quick answers on that one? Jeff, I think I saw you on mute first.
Well, I just a quick question, since I don't really know the background here. Do we have? I don't believe we have any investments in Chase. Do we just bank, as in payroll and things like that? Is that the concern?
I think that's the concern. Yes.
Yeah, because I'm pretty sure, as a member of the investment committee, that we're not actually shareholders. So we I think from the get-go would have a less involved. They can use only so much as in the checking account to do things, rather than we're not propping up their stock. But something personally I would like to look into because I don't have any background on that.
Okay, thank you. Reverend Mahap, I think did you have something to say? Or was I just seeing you out of the corner of my eye? Okay. Is there any other comments on Chase Bank before we move to close here?
I would acknowledge the fact that the whole issue of pipelines is, again, a demonstration. If you look at the Dakota pipeline, that originally it was going to go through a wealthier community, and they protested and said no, and now it ended up being cited through a Native American community and jeopardizing water and et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is very much in play from the administration's perspective, and hopefully, I hesitate to ever say we've heard the last, but hopefully things are going to move in the right direction there. But again, this is one of those very tricky issues of citing energy resources in communities that can at least defend themselves. So I'm just expressing the fact that the questioner has extremely legitimate concerns.
They're extremely legitimate, and I think it brings into question a whole host of issues, beginning with nonviolence, but also I think who we choose to engage with as a seminary. But I think we are at time. I would like to thank everyone. Wow, 2 hours on Zoom, and not like we're on Zoom at all, So thank you for adding this to your day. Thank you for being with us. We'll be doing this again next year. This is a 10-year-long project. Hopefully, if we can keep up this democratic mandate and keep our community holding each other accountable to both the goals that we're setting for ourselves and to each other in this process. So in a year from now, I hope that we have some like audit numbers to look at. We've made some progress. We've discovered new things that we need to work on, and we've kind of we've delved deeper into building right relationships and kind of exploring these theological issues and developing new theologies out of our experiences with one another. So thank you so much, and I will see y'all tomorrow for the community assembly participants and our experts. So looking forward to that, and thank you again. Talk to y'all later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.